Dear learners, I welcome you to the MOOCs course on oral history. Today, I will discuss authenticity in oral history. This lecture is divided in mainly two parts. In the first part, we will briefly discuss what is oral history, and in the second part, we will discuss our main topic, authenticity in oral history. So, let us see what is oral history. Dear learners, oral history is a practice and a method of research. It involves recording of the spoken memories of people who have something important to say about the past and then analyzing those memories. In this sense, oral history is not about collecting information. It is also about understanding how people remember, interpret and narrate their experiences. As a research practice, oral history is surrounded by many debates. Oral historian Alessandro Portelli describes oral history as something that is always unfinished. According to him, oral history floats between the present and an ever-changing past. It exists in the dialogue between the interviewer and the narrator. It also moves between orality and writing. Because of this, oral history is never fixed. It is fluid, open-ended and constantly evolving. He also points out the poetic quality of oral history. Oral narratives are not only factual accounts, they are expressive and emotional. Oral history easily crosses disciplinary boundaries and can be used by historians, anthropologists and sociologists as well as other disciplines. At the same time, it is fragile and temporary in nature. These questions make oral history both fascinating and challenging for historians. In fact, the term oral history is a catch-all term, or it has several aspects and meanings. First, it refers to the process of conducting interviews and recording people's memories of the past. Second, it refers to the product of the process, that is, the narrative or account that emerges from the interview. Therefore, oral history is both a research method and a historical source. Other terms such as personal testimony research or life story research are sometimes used, but historians generally prefer oral history as an umbrella term that includes both practice and output. Oral history is used not only in history but also in disciplines such as anthropology, ethnology, sociology, psychology and healthcare studies. Oral history now occupies an important place within the broader field of social science research. In oral history practice, certain terms are commonly used. The person who conducts the interview is called the interviewer or researcher. The person who gives the interview is called the interviewee, respondent or narrator. The interviewee is an in-depth conversation with a living witness about the past. The recording is the audio or audiovisual product of the interview. The transcript is the written version of that recording. Oral history includes all these things, from interviewing to transcription and interpretation. Despite its growing acceptance, oral history was not always accepted as proper methodological discipline of historical inquiry. In its early years, many historians and social scientists were suspicious of oral history because it relied on memory. Memory was considered unreliable and subjective. At a time when historical research was dominated by written documents, oral history was criticized for producing evidence that could not be easily verified or counted. It was seen as lacking objectivity and scientific rigor. Traditional historians, especially those who are influenced by the Rankian school, have criticized oral history as unreliable and imprecise, and have argued that historical inquiry should rest on verifiable written sources. To respond to these criticisms, early oral historians made great efforts to defend their work. They tried to verify oral evidence by cross-checking it with written documents. They examined internal consistency and placed oral narratives within a wider historical context. Oral historians, influenced by social science, also worried about whether their interviewees were representative. As a result, they used sampling methods and treated respondents almost like scientific data. Sometimes they also assigned them numbers. At the same time, other forms of oral history emerged that were more literary and creative. They were often criticized by traditional historians. For example, Paul Thompson questioned the authenticity and reliability of oral histories that prioritize narrative style over strict methodology. He felt that such works lacked careful scholarship. These debates about reliability and authenticity continue even today. However, oral history is not valuable only because it prioritizes factual information. Its real strength lies in its ability to capture subjective experience. Oral history shows us not just what happened, but how people remember what happened and how they give meaning to their experiences. As Ron Grayley explains, oral interviews tell us what people thought happened and how they have internalized and interpreted past events. Memory, therefore, reflects the past as seen through the lens of the present. So, we can say that oral history exists in several forms. First, there is the original spoken interview. Second, there is the recorded version of that interview. Third, there is the written transcript. And finally, there is the historian's interpretations of the material. Each stage involves some form of mediation and editing. The historian listens to and reads different versions of the same narrative and then produces yet another version through interpretation. At each stage, important questions arise that affect meaning and authenticity. Translations and editings further complicates this process. Oral narratives are often translated, shortened, or rearranged. While this makes them accessible, it also changes their form and sometimes their meaning. These changes raise important questions about authenticity and representation. In this lecture, we will be talking about authenticity, and in the next lecture, we will cover questions of representation in oral history. Oral history is therefore much more than a technique for collecting facts. It is a creative and interactive method that forces historians to deal with multiple layers of meaning. What makes oral history unique is the combination of doing the interview and interpreting meanings that people attach to their memories. Unlike written sources, oral history involves direct interaction with living people. Anthropologist Renato Resaldo warns against treating oral testimonies like written documents. Spoken narratives are not simply information passed unsensed from one person to another. They are shaped by context, performance, and interactions. Because of these, oral history requires analytical methods that are different from those used for written sources. In 1979, Alessandro Portelli argued that oral history should be understood as a distinct genre of historical practice. He described it as a form of discourse in which orality and writing work together to speak about the past. According to Portelli, oral history is defined not just by its content, but by the dialogue between historian and the narrator, and by the historian's active role in shaping and presenting the narrative. It is the practice of oral history rather than information alone that makes it unique. One of the most important features of oral history is that it involves communication within the living human beings. At the center of oral history are real people. The researcher asking questions and the narrator responding. All the complexities of oral history arise from this human interaction. These complexities create challenges, but they also give oral history its strength. Portelli identifies several elements that make oral history sources fundamentally different from other historical sources. These include orality, narrative form, subjectivity, credibility, objectivity, and authorship. Other scholars have added elements such as performativity, mutability, and collaboration. Together, these features show that oral history is not simple or straightforward source, but a rich and layered one. In oral history, when narrators tell their life stories, they are not only describing past events, they are also revealing their present sense of self. Oral history interviews, especially life history interviews, allow individuals to construct meaning, reflect on their experiences, and express identity. In this way, oral history connects memory, identity, and history in a powerful manner. Dear learners, in the above discussion, we have incorporated several dimensions of oral history, including the questions of authenticity, which is our main concern today. Now, let us understand the authenticity in oral history. Authenticity has been one of the most important concepts in oral history. Since the emergence of oral history as a methodological intervention in the mid-20th century, historians have repeatedly asked whether spoken memories can be treated as authentic historical evidence. Early critics questioned the reliability of memory, the subjectivity of narrators, and the mediating role of the interviewer. However, as Lynn Abrams demonstrates in oral history theory, the discipline has gradually moved away from a narrow positivist concern with factual accuracy towards richer understanding of authenticity as meaning, interpretation, narrative construction, and lived truth. Abrams argued that authenticity in oral history does not lie in the reconstruction of an objective, unmediated past, but in understanding how individuals construct accounts of their lives within specific social, cultural, and temporal context. Oral history thus prioritizes the truth of the telling rather than the telling of the truth, a shift that has reshaped debates around historical knowledge, evidence, and interpretation. Authenticity as accuracy and fidelity or reliability. In its formative years, oral history was deeply influenced by a desire to democratize history by recording the voices of ordinary people, particularly those who were marginalized in written archives. During the 1960s and 1970s, authenticity was largely equated with accuracy, faithful reproduction, and minimal researcher intervention. Practitioners believed that the closer the transcript was to the spoken word, the more authentic the historical sources would be. Raphael Samuel's influential essay, The Perils of the Transcript, exemplified this approach. Samuel insisted that ignoring the rhythms and imperfections of the spoken word, tidying up, decluttering, removing verbal tics, rendering dialect silence, and imposition of the researcher's interpretation of a respondent words was akin in his view of vandalism. Oral historians, including Lynn Abrams, acknowledges the ethical impulse behind this position, especially its commitment to respecting narrators and resisting elite historical authority. However, she also points out its limitations. Absolute fidelity or reliability to speech does not automatically guarantee meaning, and a transcript, no matter how precise, can never fully capture the performative, emotional, and contextual richness of a live interview. Oral interview as a communicative event. Oral interview as a communicative event. So, dear learners, oral interview in fact is a communicative event. However, while considering authenticity, we should look into it very carefully. A central contribution of Lynn Abrams' theoretical intervention is her insistence that oral history interviews are multi-layered communicative events, not neutral mediums of information. Based on David Dunaway, she emphasizes the transcription. Based on David Dunaway's, she emphasizes that transcription is not a transparent act of translation, but a form of recreation. The spoken word is embedded in gesture, tone, silence, and shared cultural knowledge, much of which is lost when speech is converted into text. From this perspective, authenticity cannot be reduced to textual accuracy. A transcript may be technically precise, yet fail to convey the narrator's intent or emotional truth. Abrams illustrates this through examples where edited prose communicates meaning more effectively than raw transcriptions, as in Ronald Blythe's Akenfield. This challenges the assumption that authenticity lies in unmediated reproduction and suggests instead that interpretive responsibility is integral to oral history practice. Life story versus life history, rethinking truth and authenticity. So, in oral history research, life history or life story is also very important aspect. So, one of the most important theoretical distinctions Abrams introduces is between life history and life story. Life history refers to a chronological reconstruction of events, while life story is a narrative shaped by memory, reflection, and present identity. Authenticity in oral history is primarily concerned with the latter. Citing anthropologist Gail Frank, Abrams explained that life story research privileges the truth of the telling rather than empirical verification. Oral historians accept that narrators may misremember dates, compress events, or alter sequences, yet these errors are themselves meaningful. They reveal how individuals interpret their past and locate themselves within broader historical processes. Abrams further draws on Daniel James' concept of the referential pact, which assumed that narrators are committed to honesty as they understand it, even if their accounts diverge from documentary records. Daniel James emphasized that the oral history text is likely to be, as with autobiography, premised on notions of fidelity to meaning rather than to criteria of strict accuracy associated with information. Authenticity, therefore, rests on dependability to meaning and intention, no strict factual. Authenticity, therefore, rests on dependability to meaning and intention, not strict factual correspondence. Memory, subjectivity, and authentic experience. Memory, subjectivity, and authentic experience. Memory plays a crucial role in debates about authenticity. Critics have long argued that memory is unreliable, selective, and shaped by subsequent experiences. Abrams does not deny this, but reframes it as a strength rather than a weakness. Memory, she argues, is interpretive and socially constructed, offering insight into how individuals understand their lives and communities over time. Drawing on feminist and cultural historians such as Lucia Pacioretty and Penny Summerfield, Abrams demonstrates that subjective memories can reveal emotional, truth, ideological tensions, and cultural norms that remain invisible in official archives. Authenticity thus lies in the experiential dimension of testimony rather than its empirical precision. This perspective also challenges the idea of a stable, authentic self. As Denise Risley observed, the self presented in an oral history interview is fluid, shaped by changing discourses and identities across time. Abrams identifies three interrelated issues arising from this insight: historical authenticity, experience, and agency. Rather than seeking an essential, unchanging truth, oral historian must recognize authenticity as situated and contingent. That is what Lynn Abrams argued. Narrative construction and meaning. Narrative constructions and meaning. Abrams places strong emphasis on narrative as a key side of authenticity. Oral history narratives are not spontaneous outpourings. Oral history narratives are not spontaneous outpourings, but carefully structured stories shaped by cultural conventions, audience expectations, and interview dynamics. Authenticity does not require narrators to provide exhaustive factual detail, but it emerges through symbolic coherence and moral logic. Henry Glassey's work on vernacular historians in Ballymenon illustrates this point. When narrators arrange facts into stories, they do so not to deceive but to convey deeper truths about community, identity, and values. Abrams argues that such narrative practices allow oral history to access truths larger than factual scrapes. In this sense, authenticity is inseparable from interpretation. The historian's task is not to strip narratives of their constructed nature, but to analyze how meaning is produced through storytelling, power, ethics, and authentic representation. Authenticity also has an ethical dimension. Abrams stresses that power relations between interviewer and narrator shape what can be said and how it is said. Claims to authenticity can sometimes mask the researcher's authority, particularly when editorial decisions are hidden or unacknowledged. Ethical oral history practices require transparency, reflexivity, and respect for narrator's agency. Editing, translation, and contextualization are unavoidable, but they must be conducted in ways that honor the narrator's intent. Abrams warns against treating authenticity as an absolute quality that the historians can extract from testimony. Instead, it is co-produced through dialogue. Dear learners, in the above discussion, we have talked about what is oral history and then the authenticity. So, in conclusion, we can say that authenticity in oral history is not about recovering an objective past, but about engaging with subjective, narrative, and experiential truth. It resides in the meaning. It resides in the meanings people attach to their lives, their stories they tell. It resides in the meanings people attach to their lives, the stories they tell, and cultural frameworks that shape those stories. By embracing memory, subjectivity, and interpretation, oral history challenges conventional historical epistemology and expands the boundaries of what is considered as historical knowledge. Authenticity is not a fixed property of testimony, but a dynamic process negotiated between narrators, interviewer, and audience. This reconceptualization has profound implications for methodology, ethics, and the writing of history, reaffirming oral history's unique contribution to understanding the human past. With this, we conclude today's lecture. Thank you.